was feeling that this was getting a little bit boring and I wanted some organic element to this character. And one thing you'll notice, especially that era of costuming, and it can be really fun to add a little bit of fur or fringe or something to this. So I'm going to keep this real simple, and I'm just going to use one of the default fiber mesh materials. And I'm not even going to change the color. It actually kind of works with what we're doing. So I've gotten him pretty far, but now I'm starting to think the exposed arms doesn't really make sense for this costume. It just feels off. So I've done those gloves in the sketch before, and now I'm thinking maybe that would look nice. And keeping some negative space to show off some of the alien anatomy. Maybe it works with whatever martial art he knows. This will definitely be something that could be more interesting. It's feeling a little dainty, a little less strong than I want it to feel right now with the negative space. But I've done the same thing as we did before. I deleted the inside of the object, and I just started to fill the holes, and now I'm just going to push and pull into his body where I want it. So I liked the exposed skin, but then I thought, we have that fun ribbing in his center. It'd be nice to bring those design beats into the other part of the costume. You want to repeat ideas as much as you can to make or go the opposite way and really break something. So this is very similar to what we're already doing. I want to make sure that it feels like it's part of the same costume and not something completely random. And again, this is a sketch, so I'm just going to keep very loose. And I'll refine it as I go. If my voice is giving out, I apologize. I've had a bit of a cold. So although I'm adding detail here, this is still just to get the idea of what I want to make. And if it works, I can refine it. And if it doesn't work, I can blast it away very quickly. Pulling in that leather orange from his shoulder pad area. The blue piping. Some of that overlaps that we have in the other area. I thought it could be kind of a nice place to bring those design beats back into this costume. And although I kept trying to expose his anatomy, I still feel that doesn't really make sense with how far we've gone with this. So I extracted off the shoulder piece and made kind of a little connection point there. Point being that as you're working, if the idea isn't working for you, it's never too late to change this stuff. It's actually really easy to change it. And asymmetry can add a lot of interest to your characters, so I'm deleting that other side. And I think I'm just going to keep that secondary shoulder pad underneath. Now, at first I wasn't loving the strapping system, but living with it for a minute, I realized I actually kind of miss it. So luckily I had duplicated that piece and I just turned it back on. And I'm seeing if maybe it's a sizing issue. So this space pirate bounty hunter, he's been through some things. You can just add dirt and grime in your final renders, but you got to have some battle damage on this type of character. So I'm going to set a morph target on the armor, on the high res, and then if I use the morph brush, I can just kind of paint away anything I sculpt on there. I recommend doing this because if you do all this damage and then they say, actually, we want a perfect, precise version, maybe there's a flashback, or maybe it's just it looks too dinged up, then you can just use a simple brush and go back to where you were. Also, probably a good idea to duplicate that subtool, just in case you forget to set a morph target, but hopefully you've been saving a lot of versions as you're working, and it doesn't really matter that much. In terms of how precise you have to be with this stuff, it's up to you. Is that going to be a focus piece? Or you're going to maybe do a study of just the chest armor? Then you might want to spend a lot of time thinking about what kind of damage it was. So I'm looking at scratches, blunt force, and some sort of blaster damage. And some of the angles are not reading the way I wanted them to, so I'm just using that pinch brush and making sure everything feels straight and more kind of uniform. Looking at some areas that we're penetrating into them. We don't want that. This is not an integrated costume. It should feel like if that's sitting on top, it should actually feel like it's pushing into the costume. So that's where I started to add some wrinkles. And these are looking a little too perfect, so I'm using an alpha and a long lazy mouse on it to add some little detail and imperfection to it. All right. I also turn on lazy snap, which is a kind of a newish feature. It's really nice for if you have to move around your object and continue the something precise, say ribbing or something like that. It'll just continue that line, as you can see, which is very useful when you're doing hard surface or costuming. I'm just trying to add some noise and different stuff to this to make it more interesting. Always trying to think of quick indications for this stuff rather than laboring over it for too long. And now I'm thinking about, what is this holding? Maybe it's a holster. Maybe it's some pouches. So I've just used the topology tools to sculpt out a little shape. And as I lived with it for a moment, I realized I like the idea of it holding some sort of ammunition, or maybe they're little grenades or something. Main reason being aesthetically, I just didn't like the idea of having some gigantic piece on there that was covering up everything else we've done. So I'm going to use the Z modeler tools here and make some sort of generic sci-fi nonsense. A lot of times you need placeholder pieces, and as the design develops, they might ask you to do a study of what does that grenade look like, or what is his weapon. So just having an interesting shape. Sometimes as a character designer, you won't actually get to do that. This would be passed off to a different part of the art department or another artist to develop what those are. And I've had it before where I've worked on stuff and indicated the shape, and then it's been passed off. And when I see the final result, they were very honest and true to what the shape I did was, sometimes surprisingly so. And other times you do something, and when you see it in the final, it's a completely new thing. So as a character artist in film, you're not always in charge of every aspect of the character's well-being. A lot of times it's a very big team effort. So So I'm going to just auto crease this thing so it's going by the angles, and when I use that dynamic subdiv, it'll kind of give me some free detailing. And I'm elongating it and just going to move it into place here. Wanted to add a few more of these on there. You can make fancy brushes that kind of do this, like curve brushes, but I still just kind of do it by hand most of the time. Probably more of a fault in my workflow, but I'm stubborn. By hand placing them, I get a nice organic feeling too. So maybe it's some of them have been used. They're not just perfectly aligned on there. So I showed you guys a few different ways of doing strapping. This way is using the curve strap snap brush. Nice tongue twister. Thank you, Pixologic. But it's actually really cool. If you drag across your object and hold shift, you'll see that it wraps all the way around. Sometimes I have trouble getting it to be perfect. So what I'm doing here is, you might notice I'm playing with the strength modifier. And what that does is you can use a thicker brush that's a wider belt, but it won't be as puffed out, as thick. And it's a feature I didn't know about for a long time, and it's really useful. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use that mirror and weld with LSIM turned on. Actually turned off. And just use that Z modeler to clean up the edges a little bit. So again, this is where having that basic understanding of topology can be helpful. Just for cleaning things up, adding a little bit of a rounded edge. And this belt's in a pretty decent place. That's about where I see the render ending, so that's why I don't really have anything too much below there. At this point, I probably should have just added some legs to the character. He's pretty finished, but sometimes you're working on this stuff and you're having fun and you just want to keep adding to it. And it's really easy. You can see at this point, if I wanted to add legs, I could just insert a sphere and start sculpting. If I needed to weld it all together, I could. So I'm retopping the arm now because later on when we get into posing, I don't want this to be a gigantic Dynamesh surface. So I'm removing the inside edge loops because that is just a waste of geometry. Don't need it. I'm going to project that detail back on. And just like before, we want this to be, if you toggle between the two, you see almost no difference, or no difference at all. If you have minor differences, rather than sweat the projection, I always recommend smoothing it away and resculpting it. 9 times out of 10, unless it's something really specific like a scan or something, it's going to be faster just to redo it. So made that double-sided for his shoulder pad, his under shoulder pad. And he's almost ready for us to get some final images out. One of the last notes that we had on the character sheet was that he should have some sort of staff weapon. And it's not going to be a focused part, so I just want something that looks techy and looks... It could go any way we want it to go, but it gives me a nice base of something to capture the imagination and hopefully develop later on. So we're back into Blender, and I'm going to use just some of its fun... nice modeling features to add some quick visual interest. Some sort of ribbing. And want to get rid of those every other edge ring. And then I'm going to add that wireframe thickness to it. So that'll give me some kind of free greeble detail. Some free gack. It looks like I spent a lot more time than I really did, but from a distance, it might have a nice feel to it. And that's all I'm looking for at this stage. A character like this, you might be asked to do 2 versions a day to this level, you might have a whole day to work on a character like this. You might have a week or more, but that's rare. So once we get a little bit of this kind of indicated detail and technology, we'll bring this back into ZBrush. You can spend a lot of time on this, but I always think we want to see how the overall feels before we worry too much about every little detail. And once we have this in place, we're ready for the next steps.